Greetings. I'd like to talk about lone terrorists, hate, and violentization theory, and I'll have several videos out. And in this first one, I'd like to start by defining hate crime. Basically, the 1990 Hate Crime Statistics Act defines hate crimes as crimes that manifest evidence of prejudice based on race, religion, sexual orientation, or ethnicity. And then in 1994, the definition also included bias against persons with disabilities. And then in 2009, it included crimes of prejudice based on gender or gender identity. And this comes from Langton and Planty's 2011 article. And looking at some of the FBI statistics, and you can go on the FBI website and get a more detailed analysis, but basically looking at the 2014 U.S. Department of Justice hate crime statistics, what was reported, that is 48% bias against race, 18.7% bias against sexual orientation, 17.1% bias against religion, 12.3% bias against ethnicity, 1.6% gender identity bias, 1.4% bias against disability, and 0.6% victims of gender bias. And again, you can get a greater breakdown there, but you can see that there's a distribution of reported hate crimes, and that doesn't necessarily match what the statistics would be if we had actual data on every single hate crime. What I'd like to do first is just talk a little bit about Sternberg and Sternberg's 2008 theory of hate. And this really gets into some of the symbolic dynamics, the thought processes, the feelings that go into hatred. While hatred may be closely related to love, in some ways it's not the opposite or the absence of love. But what we're going to look at are three components of love and hate: intimacy, passion, and commitment. And in the case of hate, the negation of the three. And so we'll go ahead and take a closer look here and see how hate can be a precursor of terrorism and other violent crimes. If we look at this idea, looking at intimacy, which relates to feelings of closeness and trust or being connected to others, and passion, or the drives that lead to romance and sex and so forth, and also a decision commitment to love and support another. That's really kind of the area of the Sternberg and Sternberg model of love. In contrast, the theory of hate focuses on the negation of intimacy. In other words, distancing, repulsion, and disgust. And then passion in hate, which would be related to anger and fear, and as intense emotions, and then also decision and commitment in hate to devalue the other person or group through contempt. And so when you put these three types of hate together, and you can get what would be probably the highest risk for violence would be burning hate, or having all three present. In other words, the person has a repulsion, disgust, anger, and fear, and a devaluation and contempt of the other. And to give you an idea, they actually, in their 2008 book, Sternberg and Sternberg, have a measurement tool. And so, for example, the negation of intimacy would be looking at questions like, I think that blank is truly disgusting. I have no empathy for blank. I feel I cannot trust blank at all. Passion in hate would be, I personally feel threatened by blank. Thinking about blank makes me feel insecure. I feel intense anger when I think of blank. So that's passion in hate. And then passion in, commitment in hate. Some of the questions there, they would ask, we need to teach our children about the danger of people like blank. I am committed to the fight against people like blank. We have to protect our ourselves against blank by every means. So when all three factors are present, that is the negation of intimacy, passion, and commitment, the risk would be highest for violence. Sternberg also talk about how important it is to use stories and analyze the propaganda in the stories and look at the ongoing themes and meanings in those stories. And I think that that's a useful model to bring into violentization theory, which looks at basically how people become violent individuals, and certainly hate is one component of that. So violentization theory really is a new approach to hate crimes and terrorism. It's based on the theories and research of the sociologist Dr. Lonnie Athens, who has much work on the subject matter. And this may be used to explain radicalization and hate processes which may lead to violent actions. And that's what we're interested in doing. Also, we can use violentization theory to study individuals, groups, communities, or entire societies for that matter. There's basically 5 stages, and I'm going to focus on the last 2. But brutalization is where one is taught how to engage in violent behavior through observation and demonstration. So in other words, people are exposed or view violent behavior. Defiance, the second stage, is a belief system that is presented to individuals or groups that is supportive of the use of violent behavior. The third stage, violent dominance engagements, focuses on engaging in violent activities, trying out violent activities, looking at the result. And then virulency is where the individual or the group define themselves as violent and dangerous. And then violent predation was added to the 4 stages more recently and focuses on extreme violent behavior. So in the 4th stage, virulency, this is where they define themselves as being a violent and dangerous person. And along with this, there's an attempt to instill high levels of fear among victims due to a threat of violence or actual violence or some self-defined situation that the perpetrator doesn't like. So the perpetrator tries to demonstrate to others that he or she can instill fear and shame in the victims. They use assault to demonstrate their power and control over the victims, as well as humiliation, and with the continued attempt to be viewed as dangerous by others. So in other words, they have incorporated a violent self into their self-definition. The violent predation stage, the 5th stage, was added, and to quote Lonnie Athens' 2015 work, where the subject's violence becomes completely unbound, exceeding the outer limits of humanity. I also have used this in my work on genocide and referred to this stage earlier on as extreme virulency, to include torture, mutilation of bodies, sexual trafficking, slavery, and other acts of brutality. Of course, this would include mass shootings and murders. Athens also described what he called the phantom community, which is a sounding board that people use to make sense of themselves in situations. And this idea of the phantom community, while originally developed to look at communities that existed in neighborhoods or families or schools, we need to take this concept and bring it into the virtual world. So in essence, we need to start studying virtual phantom communities. And the phantom community is the internal dialogue that people have that helps them make interpretations of situations and then respond how they think they should. So, for example, in the case of hate crimes, the phantom community is that voice that allows, encourages, and supports hatred and violence toward a constructed enemy. And also, we can trace and try to understand how a person's self-image changes as the phantom others and communities change over time. And this might help us look at how nonviolent individuals become dangerous and violent over a period of time. So there's these different types of self-images, and the one that's of interest to us is the unmitigated violent phantom community that fully supports violence. And according to Lonnie Athens, probably the frustrative, malefic interpretation based on hatred and anger combined would be the most dangerous. So this is where a perpetrator develops a violent plan to act out in a violent way because he or she views violence as a legitimate way to deal with an evil person or a group. And so similar to Sternberg and Sternberg's work with the burning hate, the frustrative malefic interpretation, and in this case we might say frustrative malefic hate would be where you have that anger combined. So basically we have anger and fear leading to this very strong hatred. And then Lonnie Athens also in his more recent work and book published in 2015 talks about that one's social status is a very important variable that we need to take a look at, and that people and or groups want to feel superior and will use different types of power, either psychological, physical, economic, or other types, to obtain that feeling of superiority in the dominance hierarchy. So that's something to look at. Domination being the goal. Power and force are the means to reach this domination feeling. And so that's something to take a closer look at as well. And I think what we need to do is start taking these models and theories and really applying them in a developmental, sequential way to whether it be genocide perpetrators, terrorists, terrorist groups, lone wolf terrorism subjects, violent individuals who commit serial murder and so forth. And so again, bringing in this theory gives us a very useful working model to not only understand violent behavior, but also to begin to think about stopping the process of becoming a violent individual or group, or reversing that process. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.